Hey, everybody. I'm so excited to welcome you to this public presentation and discussion led by some amazing students at Arizona State University. These students care deeply about issues of the environment, climate, and energy, and they want to do something about the state of affairs in the US. Before I continue, I want to send my best wishes to all of you and your close ones given the circumstances. I hope things are as well as they can be. My name is Darshan Karwat, and I'm an assistant professor in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society and the Polytechnic School at Arizona State University. Our framework for understanding environmental, climate, and energy challenges has evolved over the decades from a narrow focus on, say, end of tailpipe pollution to a broader perspective of sustainability in complex adaptive systems and adapted notions of rights and justice for humans, other beings, and ecosystems. Yet the institutions and governance mechanisms we refer to and rely on to address these problems have not evolved as rapidly. Oftentimes, at least to me, it just seems like we're fighting the same kinds of battles day after day, year after year. We deal with 21st century problems with tools from the 1960s and 1970s. These tools have definitely brought us a long way, but can it be different? As someone who has thought about and worked on environmental, climate, and energy issues for a few years now, within academia, on the ground, and at the EPA and Department of Energy, I've been wondering, what if we could imagine and create new governance structures? Structures that reflect our scientific, technological, philosophical, and moral advances. What would they look like? Should we do away with existing government agencies and replace them with new ones? Simply, can we even imagine something beyond where we are at? Only if we can imagine it, can we build it. And it is in this context that a few years ago, my colleague, Professor Hannah Breitz, and I thought, why don't we create an open-ended design class where we pose these challenges to students? And what can we learn from the wisdom and experience of those who created and shaped these structures, laws, and policies that we live with today? That's why, as part of this class, we brought in some of the founders and former leaders of the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, Chuck Elkins, Len Miller, Marsha Williams, Gene Lucero, and a few years ago, Tom Jorling. When I was planning the class for this semester with the course mentors last year, we decided that it should focus on the intersection issues of environmental justice, or EJ for short, and the climate crisis. When the new presidential administration began, it turns out that these very issues were at the top of its agenda. So we thought, why not have the students do their good work and actually share it with the administration? As a faculty member, I feel it is my duty and obligation to create spaces of learning and action such that those passing through university might be able to affect the change they wish to see in the world. This presentation and discussion today are the culmination of many months of debate and collaboration in a class that is called Next Generation Sustainability Governance Design. Over the semester, we heard from experts like Elisa Euler and Jerry McCann about participation and conflict resolution and collaboration building. We learned from agency-focused EJ research by Dr. Jill Harrison at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I thank all of them for their time and guidance. I especially want to thank the course mentors, Chuck, Len, Marsha, and Jean, for their time, patience, and guidance, and support for what I'm trying to do here. I could not have done it without them. I also want to thank Melissa Waite and the SFIS events team for helping put this together, and Nicole Flaherty for providing captions that comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. I want to impress on you that what you're going to hear shortly is the tip of a much larger iceberg of ideas that the students came up with from a fairly amorphous set of guidelines. They had to be ruthless in deciding what ideas rose to the top. And the entire class worked as a single team in coming up with what you're going to experience today. As you listen to these ideas and we have a discussion, I encourage you to approach your comments and questions through the lens of how these ideas are interesting to you and what possible impact you think they could have. How do these ideas move us forward? With that, let me introduce the thought leaders and change makers who participated in class. Sierra Apianes and Isaac Courtmead from the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, Natalie Severy from the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, Haley Campbell, Trevor Harper, Gabby Macrossan Ruiz de Somocurcio, Alex Ramey and Dane Whitaker from the School of Sustainability, Alex Jean and David Becker-Turk from the Fulton Schools of Engineering, and Krista Lawless from the School of Human Evolution and Social Change. I'm just so proud of the work that all of you have done this semester. Thank you so much. And with that, Haley, it's all yours.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I'll just wait a second for the slides to get pulled up here. All right, great. Thank you so much. And I hope everyone can see the slides here. And thanks, Darshan, so much for that lovely introduction. We've definitely appreciated your leadership and those of the core sponsors in this class this semester, and would like to thank you for all of that. As just shared, my name is Haley Campbell, and I am a Master's of Sustainability Solutions student at the School of Sustainability here at ASU. And I'm going to be introducing our proposed reforms to you all today. I would like to start off by giving a warm welcome to all of the attendees on behalf of the students here today. As you've just heard, our work this semester has focused primarily on reimagining the role of the federal government in environmental and climate justice. Specifically, we have focused on how the federal government could achieve the environmental and climate justice goals in Biden's executive order, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. On the next slide, you'll see one of the most prominent goals from this executive order, the Justice 40 Initiative. This initiative outlines the administration's commitment to delivering 40% of federal climate investment benefits to disadvantaged communities. In addition to centering our efforts on strategies to achieve this goal, our proposed reforms also touch on the following goals of the executive order: launching opportunities to create well-paying jobs to build sustainable infrastructure, deliver an equitable clean energy future, and put the United States on a path to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, holding polluters accountable for their actions, taking progressive action that combines the full capacity of the federal government with efforts from every corner of the nation, and lastly, creating a civilian climate corps initiative using existing appropriations to mobilize the next generation of conservation and resilience workers while maximizing the creation of accessible training opportunities and jobs. We applaud these ambitious goals and look forward to their future impacts. Yet, we foresee several potential challenges which might hinder the realization of these goals, which I'll outline in just a minute after going over a few definitions on the next slide. We thought it was important to share the definitions we are working under so that we are all on the same page during today's presentation. As you see on the screen here, we have shared two definitions of environmental justice, one from the EPA and the other from Bunyan-Bryant. As you can see on the slide here, the EPA's definition focuses more on the avoidance of harm rather than the creation of positive futures, which is the ethos of Bryant's definition, and one which we should note is informed by movements that have made environmental justice such a salient issue today. For the purpose of this presentation, when referring to environmental justice, or EJ, we'll be relying on Bryant's definition because it offers a future vision that we aim for with our proposed reforms, as well as specifies the importance of community well-being that is integral to a sustainable future. On the next slide, we have a definition of overburdened communities. When thinking about environmental and climate justice, words like marginalized, disadvantaged, disproportionately impacted, and overburdened communities are used interchangeably. Each of these words are used to establish priority for who has the greatest need. We chose to go with overburdened communities because, unlike the other words, it moves beyond personal characteristics of people who have been systemically disadvantaged and opens the door to highlighting how regulatory pressures can exacerbate challenges faced by these communities. Next slide, please. I know we are all so excited about the proposed reforms that we're going to be presenting today, but just before we get to that, I want to offer a bit more framing for how we came to our proposed reforms. For the beginning portion of the semester, Most of our work focused on exploring environmental and climate justice in the United States and how it's been addressed in the past. We started with the executive order and uncovering the challenges to achieving environmental and climate justice that the federal government may continue to face if nothing is changed. What we learned was that the federal government has failed to take accountability for ensuring EJ principles are included across policymaking and implementation. We also learned that there has been a lack of consideration of overburdened communities in environmental policymaking at large. Specifically, the federal government does not often provide information, tools, and resources overburdened communities need to effectively participate at the level the federal government will recognize as significant. Next, we learned that the court system, which is the main space where overburdened communities can take up challenges with environmental policies, is not equipped with the knowledge and tools for fully adjudicating results. Lastly, we learned that the short-term view in policymaking has left out considerations for future generations who will bear the brunt of climate impacts. In response to these challenges, on the next slide, you'll see our 4 reforms that the federal government could pursue to both mitigate these challenges and enhance the efficacy of federal environmental governance in the future. The reforms that we'll be sharing with you all today are providing guidelines for redesigning Biden's civilian climate corps in a way that prioritizes environmental justice, establishing environmental divisions in the US court system, revitalizing the interagency working groups, and creating a future generations representative position within the federal government. Without reimagining approaches for resolving EJ issues, especially as they pertain to climate change, we believe that the federal government may fail to achieve the goals outlined in the executive order in a way that benefits all of us. As we share the details of the following reforms, I encourage you to think about the suggestions and use the chat function to send Darshan a private message with your questions and comments to bring up at the end. I will now hand it over to Alex Ramey to start us off in sharing about how the goals and objectives of the Civilian Climate Corps could be redesigned to incorporate environmental justice. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Haley. As you just heard, my name is Alex Ramey. I'm a master's student in Global Sustainability Science in the School of Sustainability at ASU. I'm going to kick us off with our first proposal, redesigning the Civilian Climate Corps. Since draft legislation was released earlier this month on the CCC, we hope to take this exciting federal program and adapt it so that it better meets the goals of environmental justice and climate resilience. But before we start, I'll ask you to take a step back in history. Almost 80 years ago, FDR established the Civilian Conservation Corps. This program was designed to offer employment opportunities in public service while rapidly developing public infrastructure and recreation spaces. Continuing this legacy, President Biden's new Civilian Climate Corps, or CCC, like I said, is built as an effort to create jobs, conserve public lands, and improve community resilience to climate change. Recent press releases have suggested that up to $10 billion will be invested in the program, which could mobilize an army of public servants to construct essential climate resilient infrastructure across the US. These projects might include things like reforestation or restoring wetlands and adding green spaces to urban communities. On the surface, this sounds great, but a careful read through of the draft Civilian Climate Corps Act, which was released on April 1st, reveals that the current proposal has some drawbacks, which we show you on the next slide. To start, the benefits of this program are delivered from the top down. They don't include mechanisms for overburdened communities, which this program is meant to prioritize, to have a say in how the CCC can help them. This is just perpetuating history of overburdened communities not having a voice in environmental governance. In addition, the CCC might help build natural capacity to mitigate climate change, but it doesn't enhance a community's social and political capacity to do the same. In our view, this limits the potential for this program to have lasting and sustainable impacts. Therefore, we believe that there is a more strategic way to invest in communities that will build capacity in the long term and advance environmental justice. Next slide, please. Now, before we move on, I want to offer a little background on the existing national service programs in our country. Now, the way it typically works is that nonprofit organizations or local governments will apply to host a Service Corps member with some proposed job description and project. A young person, typically like me, would apply for one or multiple placements in a centralized web portal. The service program administrators will match those applicants to positions, and then they relocate them to their host organization. For example, I was an AmeriCorps volunteer in Virginia, and I was relocated to Wyoming. The Corps member completes a predetermined amount of hours for service, which might take anywhere from 3 months to a year, though they're often seasonal, and then they leave. Over the past 7 to 8 decades, national service programs have had a huge positive impact on public lands and community development. That said, we believe the CCC poses an opportunity for a new approach to service that responds to the salient challenges of the modern age. And on the next slide, I will start to explain this approach. To start, we suggest that the CCC adjust its fundamental mission. Missions and vision guide strategy and action. They determine how we define success. We believe that what should distinguish the CCC from past and existing conservation programs should be that its mission is to bring about environmental justice. Including environmental justice as a core aspect of the CCC's mission would mean that strategies for recruiting and training participants, selecting host organizations, and determining project goals will align with environmental justice. Without these principles baked into the CCC, this institution could actually fail to meet the demands of Justice 40, and it might even support projects that don't actually have a lasting impact on the communities that they're meant to serve. So next, we have 2 recommendations for recruitment or recruiting our Corps members. First, we propose priority hiring for local applicants. We believe communities should be able to nominate applicants from their locality. In this way, we improve community trust and choice, and we maximize the benefits flowing into target communities. Not to mention, this would offer young folks who have a passion for climate justice to have a real impact where they live. Next, the Civilian Climate Corps Act already plans to recruit diverse participants, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds. It's implied that this program will target youth, but we believe that this should be explicit, considering that youth unemployment has actually soared in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, when it comes to where CCC members are placed and what they do, we offer 2 guidelines, which you can see here. First, applicants should be hired in areas with disproportionately low climate capacity. And second, that communities should have as much choice as possible in what projects are actually conducted. Climate capacity is the ability to adapt to or mitigate the impacts of climate change. Some places have more than others. So you might find that a city like New York is vulnerable to climate change and has a number of disproportionately or overburdened communities to serve, but they already have plenty of funding and infrastructure to address those issues from their city and their state governments. So they might actually get a CCC member. But a small town in coastal Virginia, which is both vulnerable to sea level rise and has no climate action plan to speak of, well, they would. We also emphasize community choice in the projects completed. In order to support this, we recommend new training and responsibilities for Corps members. In addition to Conservation Corps programs, training is often limited. It's focused on unskilled labor, and it is typically short-term. We support instead long-term appointments with intensive training to build, as the executive order promises, robust professional skills. In order to enhance community choice in this process, we believe that host organizations should select the training their nominated Corps member receives. Because we're focused on building capacity, we understand that the necessary skills and training might focus less on managing restoration projects and a little more on technical assistance in grant writing and reporting, stakeholder engagement, using environmental justice mapping tools, and public education. The point is that the host or community would get to decide what those skills are that are flowing to them. To further support capacity building, we suggest that Corps members are responsible for supporting workshops that educate their community in how to engage in public planning processes. In addition, the core member should help their host develop a future climate action plan so that the benefits of their service will last far beyond the limits of their term and they can tangibly improve climate capacity. Lastly, for our training and responsibilities, we don't want the flow of knowledge and skills to be one way from the government down to communities. Instead, core members should serve as advocates that identify and transmit their community needs to the government for consideration. To enable this and to support the other responsibilities of the core member, we suggest one last element of this proposal, which is a mentorship program that pairs core members with experts at state environmental agencies. So the mentors would offer advice and technical expertise, and they'd oversee projects. And in the process of their work, they'd gain insight into community needs. The benefits here are that the core member would have a professional overseeing their work, which adds some legitimacy, and it creates a new pathway for connecting communities to policymakers. And on the next slide, I'll start wrapping this up. We can measure success in the long term through direct metrics on climate capacity, indicators of participation and engagement, like say the number of community members who give input into their climate action plan. And we can follow up with core members after their service to see where they land in their education and careers. Okay, on the next slide, I'll tell you how we can get started. First, political leaders must push for stronger inclusion of environmental justice within the mission, requirements, and responsibilities of the CCC. Next, we recommend a thorough review and redesign of the CCC that includes voices from key stakeholders, including environmental justice advocates and representatives from target communities. We recommend that within 1 year of this redesign, the CCC begins accepting core member nominations. Thank you for listening to this first proposal. I will now pass it off to Sierra, who will discuss the next.
Thanks, Alex. Hello, everyone. My name is Sierra Apianis. I'm a second-year law student at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, and I would like to present our next proposal, establishing specialized environmental court divisions. An important part of promoting government accountability and sustainable development is access to environmental justice and the justice system itself. Courts play a major role in enforcing environmental laws and increasing justice for those most affected by negative externalities. However, our current justice system is not fully equipped to sufficiently enforce these environmental laws and deal with climate change and environmental issues on top of what they already tackle. Next slide, please. It is generally recognized that achieving sustainable development is built from having good environmental governance. So through our research on the current justice system and how it addresses environmental issues, we've identified a few problems in which we believe our proposal will address. One is the lack of expertise among judges hearing environmental cases, a lack of meaningful access to litigation opportunities for members of overburdened communities, and the fact that courts are just generally overscheduled and don't have sufficient time to consider environmental concerns adequately. And our current governance system has a system that most environmental lawsuits are initially brought in state courts, and environmental litigation is often very technical. For example, cases can turn on the difference between 2 parts per million and 2.5 parts per million. And the issue with this is that these scientific considerations can't be effectively made by a judge who has a diverse caseload and who is focused on being sufficiently knowledgeable in a wide variety of subjects. So we propose the creation of environmental divisions in state trial courts across the US to increase access to the judicial system for overburdened communities, as well as to ensure the adequate protection of the environment into the future. So when determining where an environmental court/division will be the most effective and successful, we considered a variety of factors, including type of forum, decisional level, geographic area, cost, and legal jurisdiction. And so we recommend a federally created model state statute for which legislatures can follow when formulating their own environmental divisions. And as most environmental and EJ or environmental justice lawsuits are civil suits heard in the first instance at the state trial court level, we proposed an environmental division within these courts to be created to ensure that these cases are first heard by environmental experts. In regard to the legal jurisdiction for these divisions, we would expect cases heard would be would include civil suits relating to state environmental laws and local disputes as well. Under our proposal, we also recommend that these environmental divisions offer pro bono or free legal services to potential plaintiffs or defendants in the public interest. And local attorneys with environmental litigation experience could volunteer their time at these clinics, and this would work to increase the accessibility of justice. So to provide an example for this model court division, an environmental division could be created within the Arizona Superior Court, which is the state trial level court here in Arizona. And examples of this court's jurisdiction would include appeals from city and county zoning boards, challenges under Arizona state environmental laws, for example, laws promulgated by the Arizona Department of Water Resources or Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. Also reviews from environmental or ADEQ permits or review of municipal enforcement actions. And we expect this model to be a multi-judge bench, which would only hear environmental suits. And broadening out and expanding out nationwide, the structure of this division might differ by state, but looking to examples of existing environmental court systems can provide the basis for its development. And so looking at examples, there are two existing court systems that provide great examples of this environmental court idea. One already exists within the United States, and it's the Vermont Superior Court Environmental Division. And the other is a foreign court, and it's the Planning and Environment Court of Queensland, Australia. The Vermont Court of Environmental Division was the first of its kind in the US, and it was created in an effort to improve enforcement of the state's environmental laws. It has It has two judges with significant environmental law experience that sit on the court, and they're tasked with solely hearing environmental suits. In Queensland, Australia, the Planning and Environment Court also operates as an independent court model and has its own legislative authority. And the court judges are appointed from a full court judge roster and are competent to hear a broad range of environmental and non-environmental cases. Looking at both of these examples, both courts have similar jurisdictions over matters such as development decision appeals and appeals of municipal decisions, and cover matters, a wide range of environmental and non-environmental matters. Also, both courts provide alternative dispute resolution, or ADR, and other alternative dispute services free of charge, with mediators being knowledgeable environmental matters as well. And ADR and like services reduce costs for parties and can provide a more equitable outcome. So we propose all environmental divisions include these services to its constituents. Next slide, please. So this type of legal configuration would have a profound effect on the outcomes of environmental litigation. And we see 5 main impacts that this change would have. 1, increased access to justice and dispute resolution services. 2, consistency in procedures and outcomes. 3, equitable distribution of environmental justice. 4, an evolving development of environmental law. And finally, the outcomes that it produces would be more in the public interest. Next slide, please. And so these impacts would be measured through an eventual evaluation of case decisions coming out of courts. And we expect the system to produce a wide array of case law in which future legal and environmental experts can analyze to understand its success. Additionally, the United Nations published a report entitled Environmental Courts and Tribunals, a Guide for Policymakers, that we see could be used to determine best practices for a division such as these. Additionally, evaluation can be based on factors such as the type of claims reviewed in the court, accountability and accessibility, the expeditious and timely manner in which cases are reviewed, whether the process is understandable to those who use it, and the responsiveness to user needs. And so to wrap up, we expect the next steps of this pilot program to include the creation of a report outlining best practices and structural and procedural recommendations for states hoping to implement this environmental division within their court system. And our hope for this proposal is to increase access to the justice system in relation to issues arising from climate change and the environment. And with these state trial court environmental divisions as the pilot program, we hope to initiate the creation of a full environmental court system and environmental justice concern, and to ensure that environmental justice concerns are continuously considered throughout the entire judicial system. Thank you for listening, and now I'll pass it off to Dane to hear our next proposal. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Sierra. I'm Dane Whitaker, a PhD student in sustainability. And the third reform proposal is renewing commitments to the Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice. And so as we get started, like Alex did with the CCC, I'll take us a few steps back in history. As you see on the next slide, former President Clinton signed an executive order in 1994 establishing the working group and charging it to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human or environmental effects of their programs, policies, and activities on minority and low-income populations. So this working group is convened by the Environmental Protection Agency. It had 11 members in 1994 when it was formed, and it grew to 16 members in 2011 when the members renewed their commitment to the working group in a Memorandum of Understanding. So let's break that down a bit. The members of the working group are committed to reviewing and improving their programs and policies to address negative impacts on overburdened communities. 16 federal agencies committed to environmental justice for the past 3 decades. That's just so cool. On the next slide, we see that while agencies are committed to improving their programs and policies to address environmental justice, they face challenges following through. In 2011, 16 federal agencies signed a Memorandum of Understanding that they would produce strategic plans and reports annually to update progress towards more just operations. The figure in the middle of this slide, produced by the Government Office of Accountability, thank you, shows that over time, the number of agencies updating their strategic plans and reports has decreased from 14 agencies, so all but 2 in 2012, to 4 agencies, or just a quarter in 2017. We looked into it and identified 3 challenges that agencies face contributing to this trend. First, the focus on environmental justice changes with the priorities of the Office of the President. And thus, there's no consistency to the visibility and accountability of the working group. Second, agencies have limited personnel and funding dedicated to the working group. The Environmental Protection Agency and Department of Energy had dedicated funds and staff. The remaining 14 agencies shared staff and funds from other priorities. And third and finally, the third challenge is that the reporting and planning practices for environmental justice projects are underdeveloped. The dearth of standards provided by the working group leaves it to already overtaxed agency staff to figure out how to create strategic plans, report on those plans, and improve agency policy and programs. So there's a lot of really great work coming out of the working group. So all of our suggestions are around strengthening the work of this working group. On the next slide, I'll walk through the opportunities we identified for the working group and the member agencies. Here we propose 2 suites of opportunities, one for the working group and one for the member agencies. I'll walk through the working group opportunities on the left side of the slide first. Clear, actionable goals will help the working group align on priorities and the member agencies understand how they can contribute to those priorities. Next, the Environmental Protection Agency, as convener of the working group, can coordinate the development of planning and reporting practices, perhaps based on the EJ Screen tool, as Abraham Tidwell mentioned in the chat a few minutes ago. For agencies with limited resources, this will make it easier to review their programs and policies and update the working group. And finally, we believe the working group needs increased visibility and accountability. In addition to reporting to the Office of the President, the working group could report to the appropriate congressional committees and the Council on Environmental Quality. Now, moving to the right-hand column, we'll look at some of the opportunities for the member agencies. We learned that limited staff and funds are available for environmental justice. Our first reform suggests that agencies make or request budget to make renewed material commitments to environmental justice. We also suggest coordination of enforcement. We also suggest signing a new Memorandum of Understanding now that almost a decade has passed. Next, we suggest coordination of enforcement and prioritization of issues across agencies, sharing projects and data where appropriate. And finally, environmental justice focused staff often struggle to implement changes because their work is not seen as priority by other staffers. The administrators of the agencies can raise the priority of these projects and make it clear that environmental justice is an agency-wide priority and principle that should be applied to all programs and policies. These 6 opportunities represent our belief that the working group and the commitments of the 16 member agencies is an incredibly important and impactful mechanism, and that through these improvements, the working group can deliver environmental justice outcomes for overburdened communities. So how will we know if these reforms are working? On the next slide, we propose 3 ways that success can be measured. First, and most importantly, we should see improved environmental conditions for overburdened communities. What this looks like for the Department of Agriculture is likely different from what it looks like for the Department of Transportation, but also maybe not. Second, consistent reporting from all member agencies is a measure of health of the working group and its activities. And finally, we propose reporting on the funds requested and received related to environmental justice. This will help the working group identify whether an agency needs support applying for funds or whether they need to advocate to the budget committee for more funds to be allocated to environmental justice. On my last slide, we summarize a reform with 2 steps forward. First, the working group, under the direction of the Environmental Protection Agency, should strengthen the support it provides for member agencies through clear goals and reporting and planning best practices. In other words, help them be successful. Second, the Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice is doing great work. They should have more visibility of their efforts and accountability for keeping up the good work. To do this, they should report to Congress, the Council of Environmental Quality, the Office of the President, and of course, to the public. Thank you very much. David will introduce our next reform.
Thank you, Dane. I'm David Becker-Turk, and I'm a master's student here at the Fulton Engineering School at ASU. And as Dane just mentioned, I'll be sharing our final proposed reform, future generations representation. This is a concept that at its core is designed to ensure that on a federal level, we have consideration for the needs of our future generations that are yet to come. So on the next slide, this brings us to a question of who is responsible for the future? Without the actions of those who came before us, none of us would enjoy the privileges of today's society. We were left with a world full of opportunity, and it's our obligation to carry on this legacy. From the perspective of climate change, even with immediate action, the worst effects may not be felt for another 50 to 100 years. This means that all of us here today, or most of us here today, and certainly most government representatives will not be around to experience the full impacts of the decisions that are made today. This disconnect that we have between today's actions and their consequences prevents us from being able to appropriately prioritize the amount of resources that we need to devote to these issues. As a result, intergenerational justice is frequently overlooked and future generations are all too often ignored. So on the next slide, we can look and see why this might be happening. Looking at these 2 diagrams based on Dr. George Basile's research, we can see 2 alternative worldviews. The American worldview is represented on the left, and the worldview we'd like to move towards in the future on the right. In the current American system, the environment is seen as existing within an economic system, a financial system. Often, this leads to a social and political pressure to base decisions primarily on their monetary costs. This mindset then leads to a short-term kind of thinking where the needs of the future are all too often ignored. This has led the United States as a nation to ignore or reject good investments simply because the upfront expense was too great. Our hope now is to begin transitioning to a system that looks more like the diagram on the right, where we see that anthropogenic systems like the economy and society exist within the environment, within a larger biosphere. Within this worldview, it becomes much more natural for political thinking to better prioritize long-term outcomes as we begin to look past our human lifespans when making decisions. Thinking like this aligns with sustainable future design principles, and it better provides for the resource needs of future generations. On the next slide, we can see, based on the research by the World Future Council, the criteria that we must meet for future generations' representation to be effective. These include independence, transparency, legitimacy, access to information, and accessibility to stakeholders. Independence would allow the representative to operate without conflicts, personal or political, influencing their decisions. This representative should be able to operate without being heavily influenced by any other government or private offices. A transparent office, then, is one that makes it clear what its goals are and how its actions help meet these goals. As we'd be instituting a brand new position here, it's essential that they stand up to public scrutiny and operate completely transparently. A legitimate representative, then, is one that has the support from those in the United States who they intend to govern. A legitimate representative would have a positive relationship with all of their constituents nationwide. Then, a representative must also have access to the best possible information at any given time. This way, they can make decisions and recommendations based on current best practices. Operating in the US government, there would be absolutely no excuse for the representative to not have access to the best quality information. Then finally, stakeholders must have easy representative. This way, their desires and values can be more genuinely represented in government. This means that young people in particular need to have a clear line of communication with the office of the representative and have influence over the actions that the representative makes. On the next slide, we can see that the idea that we're presenting here is not an entirely revolutionary one on a global scale. There have been forms of representation for future generations in other governments, including Norway, with an ombudsperson for children, New Zealand with a parliamentary commissioner for the environment, Hungary, who also have an ombudsperson representing future generations, and finally Wales, with a commissioner for future generations. And while Japan has no official government offices, researchers have been working very hard on future design principles, including some test programs that demonstrate the value of future generations representation. So while this is a new idea in the American context, it does come with a strong international precedent. On the next slide, though, we can see in the American context, this would look a little bit different. So the first role of our representative would be to act as a non-voting delegate to Congress representing future generations. This non-voting delegate would operate in a similar capacity as the non-voting delegate from Washington, D.C. They would still have the full power of a House member, aside from the ability to vote on the House floor, but they could still present legislation, they could argue policies on the floor, work in committees, and most importantly, they would have access to congressional resources. This would allow the representative to advise both the legislative and the executive branches, as well as any other federal agency. This would put them in a position where they, as the delegate, would have direct access to the public and could operate in full transparency. The delegate also would be age restricted to those younger than 35 to help ensure that the representative has a greater stake in the future generations that they intend to represent. On the next slide, we can see how we might get this delegate into Congress. First, this would require changing some things, including the creation of a Congressional Future Generations Caucus. The caucus would then be comprised of 10 members, one from each of the standard federal regions, and voted on by the residents in those respective regions. These representatives would be voted on by a qualified pool of voters aged 14 and older. In this case, expanding voting rights to individuals younger than 18 serves to ensure that the people who will be most affected by the decisions of the delegate and the caucus are the ones who will be deciding who holds these positions. This even has the added benefit of promoting youth political engagement. Then, once this caucus is elected, they will elect one of their own to represent them as the non-voting delegate to Congress, representing future generations. On the next slide, you can see that we do believe future generations would also benefit from representation in the executive branch. However, placement in the executive branch is a little bit more complicated, and we can see possibilities for representation in the Office of Management and Budget, as well as on the Council of Environmental Quality. This is something that we do intend to research further, and we are very interested to hear what your thoughts might be on an executive placement. Finally, on this last slide, I'd like to make clear that this kind of representation matters. It will offer a voice to the people who have to deal with the most significant impacts of today's environmental justice and climate change policies. This will instill future-thinking, long-term views of policies that will impact the management of natural resources. This outlook on policy will then also spill over into government actions impacting things like infrastructure, energy, and transportation. Future thinking should not stop with environmental matters. Instead, it should inform how society at large operates. All of this then makes the US more resilient and prepared for the future. With that, I'd like to hand it back to Haley for some closing thoughts.
Thanks, David. And as everyone just saw, throughout this semester, we've taken a deep dive into how the federal government intends to prioritize environmental and climate justice compared to what the government is doing now and what it's done in the past. Our reforms center on themes of government accountability to those whom it serves and the right of all those who live in the US to contribute to governing processes. First, we built off the existing plans for the Civilian Climate Corps and shared some ways it should be redesigned to effectively and meaningfully include overburdened communities. Second, we are aware of how other court systems around the world prioritize environmental and climate justice and believe we need that to happen here in the United States. Third, we saw an effort to incorporate environmental justice into federal agencies and proposed additional enhancements to increase accountability and transparency of EJ efforts. And fourth, we believe that future generations deserve to be represented to ensure that they are given the opportunity to thrive. Together, these solutions comprise institutional changes that enhance both the performance of government and the meaningful engagement of all those who live in the United States. Ultimately, we believe these changes will better prepare the federal government to deliver on their promise of environmental justice, especially in the context of climate change. Next slide, please. By following our proposed reforms, we believe the federal government will be able to help create a world where all of those who live in the US have agency to shape their own futures, the government is responsive and accountable to social and environmental needs, justice is accessible to all, society is resilient to threats like climate change and has the ability to mitigate its effects, our shared natural environment is clean and thriving, and where everyone, including future generations, can benefit equally from the natural resources afforded to us. I would like to thank you so much for listening to our presentation today, and we'd love to hear your feedback and address your questions. If you're unable to stay, please feel free to follow up via email. And now I'd like to turn it over back to Darshan.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful note to end on. I thank all of you for coming here, for sharing an hour and a half of your day. As I said earlier, we're going to continue work on this. Please email me at darshan.karawat@asu.edu. I can add that to the chat. If you want to continue the conversation, we're going to continue building on these ideas. I want to thank everybody from the course sponsors to the event planners for all of your time and support. And we're again looking forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you so very much.